in the world. Welcome to this week's Innovation at Work webinar from MIT Sloan Executive Education. You all now know that as this crisis unfolded a couple of months ago, we really wanted to make sure that we were continuing to provide, and at a higher frequency, these useful snippets of knowledge and capability development through this webinar, including our innovative shorter 30-minute format. We know how busy we all are and how much time we're spending watching videos and webinars and other kinds of media. So we are trying to be extremely efficient and have invited a number of our faculty colleagues to come and talk about their work and leave you with some useful skills and tips at the end. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Nelson Repenning, who is the Associate Dean of Leadership and Special Projects at the MIT Sloan School, the Director of the Leadership Center, and he's taken those positions on top of a distinguished career as a researcher in questions about why organizations so often fail to succeed implementing various management tools and practices, coming out of a disciplinary background of system dynamics, which of course was developed at MIT. In today's webinar, Nelson in particular is going to help us understand in the context of the COVID pandemic that we're all going through, which is both a crisis and creating new ways, a need for us to work in new ways. Nelson is going to discuss these 2 points that you can see here. The combination of remote work and need for rapid adaptation can create, we're discovering, new ways of not being able to succeed in our work. And we're going to learn with Nelson today an alternative approach that he and his colleagues here have developed. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Nelson, and we'll come back in about 20 minutes for some Q&A. So do please keep the questions coming through the Q&A function. Nelson, over to you.
Super. Thank you, Peter, and good day, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for taking the time to join in. So as Peter said, my goal for today is really to do 2 things, which is to give you one idea to think about how you might manage probably the rapid adaptation that is required for COVID a little bit better. But in some sense, even more importantly in my mind, is probably the central thesis today is that crisis moments tend to give you a new lens onto the way that your organization operates day to day, peacetime in some sense. And what I really hope to do is allow you to leverage this current crisis, both so that you can manage it a little bit better, but also to learn something about your organization more generally, because COVID will come to an end at some juncture. And I think the organizations that will be successful will have used this as an opportunity to learn a little bit more about themselves and hopefully to improve and to build some new capabilities. And as my slide suggests, sort of the central thesis here is that crises tend to bring out the best and worst of an organization's culture. And what that tends to look like is that most people really step up. They work harder, they do more hours, they go the extra mile, but our ability to coordinate and adapt actually in some cases tends to go down. And again, this will give us a window into some of the things that we do well and maybe not so well. So what I want to do today, well, as Peter said, the COVID crisis has really created sort of 2 competing forces. One is that we were all working much more remotely than we did before. But at the same time, we tend to need to adapt and change more rapidly. And what I'm going to argue is that the combination of those 2 forces, if they're not well managed, actually can tend to sort of cause the organization to come to a screeching halt. So to make this point, let me start with an example. And this was shared by me recently with a former student. In fact, I've gotten several emails from former students that have sort of similar stories. So this is kind of an amalgam, and I've changed all the names in the context here to protect both the innocent and guilty. But as I go through this, see if this looks familiar, and then we'll talk about it a little bit at the end. So the student question is, we'll call her Jane. She works at a professional service firm that has a face-to-face delivery model. And just like everybody else that's in this space, the COVID and the work at home sort of situation has required them to rapidly adapt. And so they are, rushing very much to try to get most of their content and deliver it online, which used to be face-to-face. Okay? Jane's a junior member of the senior leadership team at this organization, and that leadership team is working at home, and they have a virtual Zoom meeting about every 2 weeks or so. Okay? Now, Jane's pretty smart. She came up with a new technology opportunity that she thinks could help them make their deliveries more effective and create value for their clients. But it's going to require a modest financial investment in order to do it. And the first opportunity to use this new technology when she came up with the idea would be available in 6 weeks. And if they could prove it out, they could probably use it in other clients, roughly spaced about 1 month apart apiece. So hopefully, again, this looks familiar, which is that as we're all adapting to COVID, we're probably all seeing opportunities with, a relatively modest investment. We might be able to deliver our organization's sort of product or service a little bit better than we did before. Oops, sorry. Because COVID caught a lot of us off guard, what happened at Jane's company is that the investment required to bring this technology to bear was not in her original budget, and so she needed some more money. Because the leadership team is only meeting every 2 weeks, she didn't want to wait until the next meeting in order to make that request. In fact, those meetings tend to have pretty full agendas, so she wasn't sure that she was going to get it into the agenda item anyway. So she did what we would all do, which is she sent an email to her colleagues and said, is it okay if I spend this additional money so that I can go invest in this new technology and see if we can create a little bit more value for the organization? So here's what happens next. She sends it on Monday afternoon, and Tuesday at noon, the first member of the leadership team, the Human Resources VP, responds and said, there's no existing process for this particular request, and though it seemed like a good idea, the HR VP was a little bit worried about giving Jane the money because it would set a precedent for sort of future requests. Obviously, lots of these things are coming in. And the HR VP also was a little bit worried that there was some existing inequity in the budget allocation process that needed to be addressed. Okay? This is all happening via email. Almost immediately, the finance VP replies and says, actually, in contrast to what the HR VP said, there was an existing process, but maybe that process isn't appropriate in the COVID world and that the leadership team should sit down and revisit it and think about it. Okay? Sorry. The technology lead sent an email a few minutes later, confirmed that there was an existing process, provided a bit of history as to how the prior HR manager had created it. But he also said that there was some other work going on in his area that might be redundant with what Jane was proposing, and maybe that they didn't need to make this investment, but he wasn't totally sure. And then finally, the senior leader, the CEO, chimed in, and she said that didn't have a particular view on the value of Jane's investment, but was also worried about the precedent-setting part, because if they give Jane the money, then they might be inundated with a bunch of other requests, in which case all of that would have to be walked back later. Okay. The business development manager, who was sort of Jane's closest counterpart, actually didn't reply because he was underwater with another activity and didn't have time to get to his email during the 24 hours that this was happening. Okay. So we fast forward, 24 hours and a little bit. So Jane first sent the request Monday at noon. So we're at Tuesday night. Jane still doesn't have an answer, even though the email thread has now made it through the entire leadership team. So on Tuesday night, Jane, seeing that a request has made it through the leadership team without a decision, writes another note summarizing all the issues raised and requests a yes/no decision so that she can either move forward with this investment or not. Later that evening, the human resources manager who replied first chimed in again, thanked everybody on the email for all their insights, and suggested that she and Jane have a face-to-face meeting to discuss the specific details and try to work through all the stuff that had been raised in the email thread. Okay? Following that, Jane realized that in the haste of her initial email, she had actually forgotten some key details that were critical to her pitch. And so, even though it had already gone all the way through the leadership team, she emailed the HR manager back with these additional details. Jane and the HR manager scheduled the Zoom meeting, which took place on Friday. Remember, the initial request was Monday. And so it was about 5 days after Jane's initial email. And following that request, Jane got her budget request so she could go investigate the new technology. Okay. So this is a little episode that probably happens zillions of times in different organizations, but let's just sort of calculate the box score for what happened in this particular context. It took about 96 hours or 4 days from when Jane made her initial email request to when she got a decision and she could go forward. Okay. By my count, the request generated about 12 emails. So it went through the leadership team a couple different times. Let's generously assume that each of those emails took about 15 minutes to write and to think about. and that the Friday meeting that Jane and the Human Resources VP had took about 30 minutes. So put all those together, there were about 3.5 hours of knowledge work that were required to make the decision. So that means that in the time from when Jane sent the email until she got her money, over 95% of the time in that 4 days was complete waste. It was just time that the decision or the email was sitting in someone's inbox and they were waiting for someone else to reply, okay? So that means that Jane lost almost a week of development time, and she now has 5 weeks instead of 6 to develop her technology. Now, this might not seem like a big deal, but in fact, I would argue that from a process point of view, in a crisis time like COVID, this is actually a huge deal because crises sort of by definition require rapid adaptation. And our normal emphasis in organizations on planning tends not to work as well because we're dealing with unprecedented, unforeseen circumstances. And so the ability to move rapidly and to make quick investments and to run prototypes is particularly important in crisis situations. And in this particular case, because of the time required to get this decision, right, and the fact that it took Jane almost a week to get something that really had less than 4 hours worth of work in it, she lost about 16 or 17% of the time that she would have had available to her to develop this new technology. Now, maybe not such a big deal, and actually I have no particular view on whether Jane's idea was a good idea or a bad idea, but from a process point of view, taking 4 days to do something that you could do in 4 hours is an enormous impediment to the ability of your organization to adapt quickly. And notice how the fact that the leadership team is not meeting very often, and most of this is happening by email, makes this process far slower than it would be if they were meeting more frequently. Okay? So the way to understand this from a sort of, somewhat business schooly theoretical point of view is we think about the way that we get work done as having sort of 2 basic work designs. Okay? When work is very easy to plan in advance, when we say it's highly precise, it is totally appropriate to organize that work serially, meaning that I send an email to Peter, Peter sends it to Janice, Janice sends it back to me, exactly like you would see in a factory. So if the world is easy to predict, we don't actually need to meet that often because it's easy to plan what we're going to need, and I can give Peter specific instructions or he can give them back to me. Okay? In contrast, when the work is highly ambiguous, as in crisis cases, no big surprise, we need to have meetings or what we call studio sessions. We need to meet more often. So if we have a situation like COVID or like our not hypothetical, but our disguised senior leadership team, we need to get them in the room more often so that they can deal with all these new particular circumstances. Now, one of the things that's come out of the research that I do is that one of the keys to having an effective organization is that we need a set of rules that help us move back and forth between basically serial work and collaborative work on an appropriate frequency, okay? So the idea being is that when I'm down in that bottom left and I'm doing very predictable, precise work, sometimes unforeseen circumstances show up and I need a forum or a meeting where I can go to get the answer. And so ideally we would cycle back and forth between precise work and collaborative work on a frequency that makes sense for the level of uncertainty that we're facing. So any of you that have, for example, experience in agile software development know that this cycling between individual work and studio work tends to happen in most agile software development processes on about a daily basis. You have a daily stand-up meeting where you can resolve ambiguity and go back to work. But with this basic idea that we need to match the frequency or the cycling between individual work and collaborative work to the level of uncertainty, what happens in crises? Well, number one, we tend to work more individually because the cost of meeting goes up. Right now, rather than running into Peter in the dean's office in the hallway, we have to schedule a Zoom meeting. And so we're probably less likely to meet face-to-face. But at the same time, the amount of cycling we need to do between individual work and collaboration tends to go up because the world is now much more complicated and harder to forecast than it was before. So if we go back to Jane's situation, what's happening is remember that the leadership team is only meeting in this case about once every 2 weeks. So they're only cycling between individual work and sort of high quality collaboration every 2 weeks. And so what happens in those situations when I need an answer that requires the input of multiple people? Well, like most people, right, rather than scheduling a meeting, I just send an email, okay? But herein lies the problem, which is electronically mediated communication like email and Slack and text and so on and so forth is not an efficient way typically to process ambiguity, right? The right answer, in my view, for Jane is that she needed to get in the room with the leadership team meeting, make her pitch, and have everyone put in their 2 cents about whether they thought it was a good idea or a bad idea, and get a decision right then and there. And chances are, actually, it could have been a 2-hour meeting rather than a week-long process to get it done. And what our research suggests is that when we try to process ambiguity via electronically mediated communication, rather than doing it in meetings, we get a phenomenon that we call ineffective iteration, which is exactly what you see in my little case study, which is, this was an ambiguous question, right? Was Jane's idea a good idea or a bad idea? We don't get everybody in the same room to process it. And so what you get is basically an endless cycling of email with each person sort of putting in their 2 cents, and the process never comes to a particular conclusion. And so just as a diagnostic exercise, if you go through what's happening in your particular organization, just look at your email inbox. And if you have lots of email chains that have multiple answers attached to each one, chances are you're doing a lot of your sort of ambiguity processing via electronically mediated communication, which means you're probably iterating pretty ineffectively. And the solution to this problem goes back to my previous slide, which is the way to do this more efficiently is basically the decision-making team or the leadership team probably needs to meet more often so that all that ambiguity in those decisions can be made quickly in a face-to-face meeting rather than getting sort of stuck in the morass of our email inboxes. So here's a couple pieces of advice to think about how you can allow your organization to adapt faster, whether it's in crisis time or not, okay? The big takeaway from our research is you need to match the frequency of meetings to the speed with which your world is changing, right? In our world, in education, probably in your worlds, in Jane's world, in professional services, the world's changing pretty fast right now. There's a lot of ambiguity to process because almost every day you're confronted with a new possibility. Leadership teams probably need to meet more often, because if they don't, they're going to be trying to process that ambiguity, again, using electronically mediated methods, which is extremely inefficient and just slows the entire organization down, okay? We are big fans in our research project in visual management. And so online visual repositories like Trello or IOBEA, there's a whole bunch of other software packages, are great methods to capture all the issues that a meeting needs to process before it happens. People can chime in with, hey, we need to talk about this, or I need a particular decision on this thing. Those issues should be prioritized at the beginning of each meeting. So if Jane wanted to be able to get her proposal on an agenda, ideally there would have been some place where she could have posted it to the leadership team meeting in advance, and then the CEO or someone could decide whether that rose to the level that they needed to capture it in that particular meeting, okay? And then finally, my last suggestion here is meetings are an important part of knowledge work processes. I know that we all complain about them, but if you look at the way that work flows through your organization, in most cases, it has to go through some kind of meeting in order to get done. Either a decision needs to be made or a problem needs to be solved. Measure the productivity of your interactions. And one simple way to do that is simply keep track for each meeting the volume of decisions you make and the number of problems you solve in each meeting. And if that answer is 0, you probably need to revisit sort of the structure and the constitution of that meeting so you can make it a little bit more productive, okay? And then finally, tracking the funnel of the decisions that you make, particularly in crisis times, can be super useful, right? You know, Jane's organization is learning a lot about how to do stuff online that they had to do face-to-face before, and each investment they make should be treated like an experiment, and they should keep track of those things as they flow through the organization. But let me just sort of leave you with sort of the summary comment, and then we'll take a few minutes for questions, which is the basic problem that I'm seeing in all the organizations that I'm interacting with right now is they are processing a lot of decisions asynchronously via email rather than having the face-to-face meetings that they need to process those. And it's causing the organization to be able to adapt much more slowly than they probably need right now, given the level of uncertainty that they're facing in the environment. Okay, let me stop there. Peter, I'm happy to take a few questions if there's folks.
Great, thanks, Nelson. We've been getting some questions coming in, and please keep them coming. I'll keep checking them on my screen as well. But perhaps just to get us going, these ideas that you're talking about seem to be in part thinking about knowledge work through the lens of your prior research on things like manufacturing of physical work. So, what's your advice to people who are trying to apply these ideas to thinking about, where is knowledge work different from these sort of manufacturing inspired ideas that you talk about?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And if I can go back to my slide here, one of the distinctions that we make all the time in my research is the difference between principles and practices, okay? A practice is a tool that we might use. You can think of a bunch of different practices that are used on the shop floor, whereas in each practice is embodied an underlying principle about how humans do work, okay? And as many of you on the call are probably familiar with, there's been lots of attempts to take various manufacturing related practices like Toyota Production System and move them to knowledge work environments like hospitals or professional service firms or so on and so forth. And largely the evidence suggests that those things have not been particularly successful. The underlying principle here, though, in my view, is that all work processes have a mix of work that is highly standardized and work that is highly ambiguous, but that mix differs whether it's manufacturing work or knowledge work. And so therefore, if you think about a well-run factory, the number of issues that you need to escalate from an individual factory worker into a team meeting with the supervisor is relatively small. It might happen a couple times a day, okay? If on the other hand, I'm dealing with a complicated new technology or a new software development project, I probably have to escalate an individual issue into a collaborative forum very regularly. And so the thing that's going to differ between factory work and knowledge work is the frequency of cycling between individual work and collaboration, right? If I'm doing a complicated project or I have a complicated issue in a hospital, I might need to check in with my teammates every day or every hour, whereas in the factory, that's really not required. And the sort of irony of all of this is that's what's happened in the COVID crisis, is that those escalation paths, when I need the opinion of my colleagues or I need a decision from my senior leadership team, those escalation paths have become less clear and less frequent. And so, as I said earlier, we've moved more knowledge work into this ineffective iteration mode. And again, at least in the organizations I'm seeing and working with, it's caused them to, their adaptation speed to go down precisely at the moment when they probably need to do it faster rather than slower.
And just while you were talking, a few people were wondering, looking at this slide, do you ever see organizations that try to organize standard work or precise work using collaboration, real-time collaboration?
Yeah, I think, agile software development is a great example of a really sort of precise scheme of we have the daily stand-up meeting every morning. It tends to be supported by a visual management system. We decide what we're going to do today. We go off and we develop and we come back the next day and we do it again. I think in some medical crisis situations right now, people are needing to meet with their teams every hour in some cases because the world is changing so quickly. And I think the big takeaway here is that if you can give your organization some clarity on that cycling between factory and studio work, whether it's every day or every hour, the amount of communication that will happen off cycle, particularly by text and email, will go down. Because Peter, if I know I'm going to see you in the next hour, okay, I can wait that long to get a decision for what I need, as long as I have confidence that I'm going to be able to get that, in an hour, in a day. If those escalation paths are unclear, then I'm more likely to pick up my phone and call you, and I may well be interrupting you doing something else, and you start to get, again, this kind of ineffective iteration mode, which tends to slow things down.
Sure, that makes sense. I'm seeing a few questions from people who are worrying that this could be seen as a manifesto for more meetings, and we're already zoomed out, I think is the expression that people are using. Perhaps you could comment on that, and perhaps maybe in the context, as I'm thinking about some of these questions, of what's the balance between process that you just described and empowerment. What do people need to be empowered to do to make that a two-way staircase, not a one-way escalator going up to
no, that's a fabulous question, and you're exactly right. We don't want to be on Zoom 10 hours a day. We're already there already. And I would say two things about that, which is number one, in my experience, most meetings are poorly designed, meaning that the time we are in the meeting, we don't tend to use particularly effectively. And that's in large part because I think people tend not to visualize meetings as one part of the larger flow of knowledge work. It's a little bit like the sort of old "the buck stops here" saw. If you think about the little case study I started with, in Jane's organization, one role of that senior leadership team is they need to allocate resources, right? But in many cases, meetings are not sort of designed so that, hey, we've got 6 requests that we need to process. We need to do them in the next 30 minutes. Let's go. So I think there's often major gains in just getting clear and what's the purpose of that meeting. But the other thing here is if you look at my little slide with the escalation paths, we often talk about how in sort of standard work down at the left, you need a rule that we call a trigger. And the trigger basically says is what is the sort of boundary or authority beyond which someone has to escalate the issue into a more collaborative setting or to the senior leadership team, right? And I didn't really make a big deal about this in the case study, but another sort of problem with the little story I gave you about Jane is that the trigger or the sort of budget authority in this case was not clear, right? If that leadership team doesn't have time to process all these requests, maybe they need to expand the boundary a little bit and say, look, you know, if the investment's less than $50,000, don't call us. We trust you, right? And the big advantage of being very clear and precise about that trigger is it allows you a way to kind of dial up or dial down the number of issues that are escalated to the senior leadership team, right? If the senior leadership team simply can't manage all those things, maybe then they need to sort of loosen the budget strings a little bit. Or if you're not getting any issues escalated to you and you've got sort of too much empowerment, but not enough coordination, maybe you need to tighten the screws down a little bit so you're getting kind of the right number of escalations.
Great. Is there an issue in the kind of scenario that we're in at the moment where in these kinds of crises, actually the whole concept of precise or standard work in many cases has gone out the window because there is so much uncertainty and ambiguity? And you know, what's your advice to people who are really grappling with that? Or maybe people don't even have very clear that their job description is no longer a good description of what they need to be doing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's another little paradox here, which is, you know, the world is very uncertain and there's lots of stuff going on. And so I think we all have the tendency to devolve to kind of a seat of the pants execution mode. But the paradox is that in times of great uncertainty, at least in my view, you need to be ever more disciplined about the experiments that you choose to run and you choose not to run, because we don't have infinite resources and we're all trying to learn about how this new world works. And so, yes, there's not a lot of standardization, but here I would go back to my final bullet point, which is that as you're trying to learn about how this new world is going to work, I think it pays to be enormously disciplined about keeping track of the experiments that you have underway. So in this case, it might be, look, we have no idea how to deliver content for this professional service firm. Let's, you know, put our chips down on 10 different experiments that we think are the most illustrative, and then let's make sure we check in on them next week to figure out what are the things we learned, and then we'll choose 5 or 10 more. Because I think what happens in a lot of organizations that I happen to know, this is happening in the one that I reported, is that, and again, this goes back to the best and worst of culture, right? You've got a bunch of empowered individuals that are all out there doing their best to serve clients, but because there's no discipline about the number of experiments they have in the funnel, Joe over on client X may learn a great trick about how to do things better that may or may not get shared to the other client delivery teams. And so we're losing that sort of organizational learning. Whereas if we could bring people back together in that collaborative space, let's say weekly or monthly, then we get a better chance of spreading those ideas across. So it's hard, but I can't emphasize enough, being disciplined about the experiments you're running will give you the process to then make sure you're squeezing all the learning that comes out of each of those, whether it's a success or a failure.
So the key to all this is being disciplined and systematic in how you apply it. And that seems like a really good note to end on. Thank you, Nelson, for spending this 30 minutes with us. Thank you all. I think we've just got a couple of additional resources if people would like to learn more that Nelson has put together here. Practicing some of what we've been talking about. Both these executive education programs have been moved into a new way of teaching online. So if you would like to explore those, here's some information about them. And we will be sharing the recording of this this webinar with everybody who registered within the next day or so. So it remains to me to thank you once more, Nelson Repenning, for this fascinating discussion. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see many of you next week in our next webinar.
Thank you all very much.